Emma had always been fascinated by unsolved mysteries, particularly those involving historical disappearances. As a seasoned investigator, she had spent years exploring the darkest corners of history, piecing together puzzles that had stumped others. When she first heard about the disappearance of the 3 lighthouse keepers from Eilean Mor in 1900, she knew she had to uncover the truth. She arrived on the remote island on a foggy morning, the lighthouse standing tall and foreboding against the mist. The isolation was palpable. The only sounds were the crashing waves and the distant cries of seabirds. Emma's boatman, a local named Angus, wished her luck but warned her to be careful. "People say the island has a mind of its own," Angus said. "Strange things happen here." With a nod, Emma stepped onto the rocky shore, her mind set on finding answers. She made her way up the steep path to the lighthouse, her footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. Inside the lighthouse, Emma found it eerily preserved, as if the keepers had left just yesterday. Dust-covered furniture and untouched equipment gave the place a ghostly atmosphere. Her primary goal was to find the logbooks kept by the missing men James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur. After hours of searching, she discovered the logs in a drawer in the head keeper's office. The entries were detailed, describing the daily routines and observations of the keepers. However, as she read further, the entries grew increasingly strange. Marshall's entries spoke of intense storms and peculiar lights in the sky. Ducat mentioned feelings of unease and shadows moving in the fog. MacArthur's final entry was the most disturbing. "The sea is raging and the winds howl. Something is here with us. We are not alone." Emma felt a chill run down her spine. What had these men experienced? She knew she had to dig deeper. Determined to uncover more, Emma decided to explore the island itself. She ventured into the surrounding area, noting the rugged terrain and treacherous cliffs. The island's isolation was overwhelming, and she could understand how the solitude could affect one's mind. As she explored, she came across an old, weathered stone with strange carvings. The symbols were unfamiliar, but they seemed ancient, possibly linked to the island's history. She took photographs and made notes, hoping to research them later. Emma also found remnants of old campfires and makeshift shelters, suggesting that others had visited the island since the keeper's disappearance. She wondered if any of these visitors had experienced the same strange phenomena. That night, Emma returned to the lighthouse to review her findings. As she sat by the flickering lantern, she heard a faint whispering sound. She looked around but saw nothing. The whispering grew louder, filling the room with an eerie presence. She felt a sudden drop in temperature, and the lantern's flame flickered wildly. Shadows danced on the walls, and Emma saw fleeting figures in the corners of her vision. Panic set in, but she forced herself to stay calm and observe. The supernatural activity seemed to mirror the experiences described in the logs. Emma realized that the island's isolation might have triggered hallucinations in the keepers, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something more sinister was at play. Determined to find rational explanations, Emma decided to stay another night, documenting everything she experienced. She set up recording devices and cameras, hoping to capture any unusual activity. The next day, Emma went through the island's history, seeking any clues that might explain the strange occurrences. She visited the mainland's local library and spoke to historians and folklore experts. One name kept coming up: the legend of Eilean Mor. According to local folklore, the island was cursed by the spirits of an ancient tribe that once inhabited the area. The tribe had been driven away by invaders, leaving behind a curse that plagued anyone who dared to settle there. Over the centuries, there had been numerous reports of mysterious disappearances and ghostly apparitions. Emma was skeptical, but couldn't ignore the similarities between the legend and the experiences of the lighthouse keepers. She decided to return to the island with a local historian named Margaret, who had studied the legend extensively. On their final night on Eilean Mor, Emma and Margaret conducted a thorough investigation. They set up cameras and recording devices around the lighthouse, hoping to capture evidence of the supernatural. As darkness fell, the whispering began again, louder and more insistent. Shadows flitted across the walls, and the temperature plummeted. Emma and Margaret huddled together, documenting every detail. Suddenly, the lighthouse door slammed shut, and the lanterns extinguished. The air grew thick with a palpable sense of dread. They heard footsteps echoing through the halls, and ghostly figures appeared, their faces twisted in torment. Emma felt a cold hand on her shoulder and turned to see the apparition of a man in a keeper's uniform. His eyes were filled with desperation as he mouthed the words, "Help us." Margaret, too, was experiencing the supernatural onslaught, and they both realized they were witnessing the spirits of the missing keepers. They had to find a way to communicate and understand what was keeping these souls trapped on the island. Emma and Margaret decided to conduct a séance, hoping to make contact with the spirits. They sat in a circle, holding hands and calling out to the lost souls of Eilean Mor. The air grew colder, and the whispering intensified. Suddenly, the figure of Samuel appeared again, this time more solid and determined. He spoke in a low, haunting voice, revealing the truth behind their disappearance. The keepers had been trying to protect the island from the curse, but their efforts had only angered the spirits. To break the curse, they needed to perform a ritual using the ancient symbols Emma had discovered. They had to do it at the stone with the carvings, under the light of the full moon. With no time to waste, Emma and Margaret gathered the necessary items and hurried to the stone. They performed the ritual, chanting the words Samuel had taught them. The air crackled with energy, and a blinding light enveloped the island. As the light faded, the island grew quiet. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the ghostly apparitions disappeared. Emma and Margaret felt a sense of peace wash over them, knowing they had freed the trapped spirits. Back at the lighthouse, they found the logs and recordings undisturbed, as if the supernatural events had never happened. But Emma knew the truth; she had experienced it firsthand. She and Margaret left Eilean Mor, feeling a deep sense of accomplishment. They had uncovered the mystery of the vanishing keepers and brought peace to their restless souls. Emma documented her findings and shared the story with the world, ensuring that the legend of Eilean Mor would be remembered and respected. She continued her work as an investigator, always driven by the desire to uncover the truth, no matter how dark or mysterious. Robert was excited yet anxious as he approached Black Rock Point Lighthouse. After years of working various jobs, he had finally secured the position of lighthouse keeper, a role he had longed for due to his love for solitude and the sea. Located on a remote cliffside known for its violent storms and treacherous waters, Black Rock Point was both beautiful and intimidating. His arrival was greeted by the roar of crashing waves and the cry of seagulls. The lighthouse stood tall and imposing, its white paint peeling, revealing the weather-beaten stones beneath. Robert took a deep breath, steeling himself for the challenge ahead. The previous keeper had vanished mysteriously, leaving no clue as to his whereabouts. The only trace left behind was the old logbook, which Robert found tucked away in a dusty drawer. As he began to settle in, he decided to read through it, hoping to find insights into his new duties. The logbook started off mundane, with detailed entries about daily maintenance, weather conditions, and ship sightings. However, as Robert read further, the entries took a darker turn. The previous keeper, Harold, had described hearing strange noises at night, seeing ghostly apparitions, and experiencing inexplicable equipment malfunctions. Harold's final entries were filled with paranoia and fear. He wrote about hearing whispers in the wind, seeing shadowy figures in the corners of his vision, and feeling a constant sense of being watched. The last entry was particularly unsettling. "I fear my mind is not my own anymore. The lighthouse has taken me. If anyone reads this, beware." Robert felt a chill run down his spine. He wondered if the isolation had driven Harold mad, or if there was something more sinister at play. Determined not to let fear consume him, Robert resolved to do his job diligently and stay vigilant. In the following weeks, Robert settled into his routine. He performed maintenance checks, monitored the weather, and ensured the light was functioning properly. The isolation was peaceful at first, allowing him to immerse himself in the rhythm of the sea. However, it wasn't long before strange occurrences began. One night, as he was reading in his quarters, he heard faint whispering sounds. He brushed it off as the wind, but the whispers grew louder and more distinct over time. They seemed to be calling his name, urging him to come closer. Robert also noticed equipment malfunctioning without explanation. The lighthouse light would flicker and dim, tools would go missing, and the radio would emit static-filled voices. He tried to rationalize these events, attributing them to the age of the equipment and the harsh environment. Despite his efforts to remain calm, Robert couldn't shake the feeling that he was not alone. The sense of being watched grew stronger, and he often saw fleeting shadows out of the corner of his eye. His sleep became disturbed by nightmares of drowning and being trapped in the lighthouse forever. One stormy night, as Robert was inspecting the light, he saw a figure standing at the edge of the cliff. It was a man, dressed in old-fashioned lighthouse keeper attire, staring out at the sea. Robert called out, but the figure did not respond. When he approached, the figure vanished into thin air. Shaken, Robert returned to the logbook, searching for any mention of such an apparition. Harold had described similar encounters, noting that the ghostly figures seemed to be former keepers. Robert realized that he was not just dealing with hallucinations, these apparitions were real, and they were trying to communicate with him. Determined to uncover the truth, Robert began to dig deeper into the history of Black Rock Point. He discovered that several keepers before Harold had also disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The lighthouse had a dark history of driving its keepers to madness or worse. As the days passed, Robert's mental state deteriorated. The whispering grew incessant, and the apparitions became more frequent and menacing. He started to see faces in the fog and hear footsteps echoing in the empty halls. His once logical mind became clouded with fear and paranoia. He felt trapped, as if the lighthouse itself was alive and feeding off his sanity. He began to keep his own log, detailing the terrifying events he experienced, hoping that someone would find it if he too disappeared. Robert's nights were filled with restless sleep and vivid nightmares. He dreamt of drowning in the stormy seas, of ghostly hands pulling him into the depths. He often woke up drenched in sweat, the whispers still echoing in his ears. One evening, as he was writing in his log, the lighthouse light went out completely. He rushed to the top, battling the howling wind and rain, only to find the machinery in perfect condition. The light should have been working, but it wasn't. In a moment of desperation, Robert called out to the spirits, demanding to know what they wanted. To his horror, a cold, spectral voice answered, "Join us." Terrified but determined, Robert decided to confront the spirits head-on. He set up cameras and recording devices around the lighthouse, hoping to capture evidence of the supernatural. He also contacted a local historian, Mrs. Bennett, who had studied the lighthouse's dark history. Mrs. Bennett arrived at Black Rock Point, bringing with her old records and photographs. Together they pored over the documents, piecing together the tragic stories of the previous keepers. They discovered that the lighthouse was built on the site of a shipwreck, and the souls of the lost sailors were believed to haunt the area. The spirits of the sailors were angry and vengeful, trapped between worlds and lashing out at the living. They saw the keepers as intruders and sought to drive them away or claim them as their own. Mrs. Bennett suggested performing a cleansing ritual to appease the spirits and release them from their torment. Robert was skeptical but willing to try anything to end the nightmare. As the storm raged outside, Robert and Mrs. Bennett prepared for the ritual. They gathered candles, incense, and a bell, following the instructions from an ancient maritime prayer. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with anticipation. They began the ritual, reciting the prayer and ringing the bell to call forth the spirits. The temperature dropped sharply, and the room filled with a ghostly presence. The apparitions appeared, their faces twisted in anger and sorrow. Robert and Mrs. Bennett stood their ground, continuing the prayer. The spirits grew more agitated, the whispering reaching a deafening crescendo. But as the final words of the prayer echoed through the lighthouse, a calm descended. The apparitions began to fade, their expressions softening. The whispering ceased, replaced by a serene silence. The light in the lighthouse flickered back to life, shining brightly through the storm. Robert felt a sense of relief wash over him. The spirits had been freed, and the curse of Black Rock Point was lifted. He thanked Mrs. Bennett for her help, knowing that he could now continue his duties without fear. With the spirits at peace, Robert found a renewed sense of purpose. He continued his work at the lighthouse, maintaining the light and ensuring the safety of passing ships. The strange occurrences ceased, and the sense of dread lifted. He kept the logbook as a reminder of the ordeal, adding his own entries to document the haunting and the ritual that ended it. He hoped that future keepers would read it and understand the importance of respecting the history and spirits of Black Rock Point. Robert also stayed in touch with Mrs. Bennett, who published her findings in a local historical journal. The story of Black Rock Point became well known, drawing visitors and researchers intrigued by its dark past. As the months passed, Robert found peace in his solitude, knowing that he had survived the lighthouse's trials. He watched the sun rise and set over the cliffs, the waves crashing below, and felt a deep connection to the place he now called home. Stormwatch Light, a lonely lighthouse on a remote island, had been automated for decades. Its solitary beacon still guided ships safely through the treacherous waters, but no human keepers had set foot there in years. A team of researchers, led by Dr. Emily Carter, arrived on the island to study the effects of long-term isolation on lighthouse keepers. Emily, a psychologist, was fascinated by the mental toll of isolation and had gathered a team of historians and technicians to help her. Among them were Mark, a seasoned historian, and Lisa, a tech expert. As their boat approached the island, they marveled at the lighthouse standing tall against the stormy skies, its light cutting through the fog. The island was desolate, with rocky shores and wind-swept cliffs. They docked the boat and made their way to the lighthouse, carrying their equipment and provisions. Emily was eager to explore the site and uncover the secrets hidden within its walls. Inside the lighthouse, they found it eerily preserved, as if the last keepers had just left. Dust covered the furniture, and cobwebs hung in the corners. Mark discovered an old journal tucked away in a drawer, the leather cover worn and cracked. It belonged to the last human keepers, who had vanished mysteriously. Emily read aloud the journal entries, which started off routine but soon took a darker turn. The keepers described seeing ghostly figures in the fog, hearing disembodied voices, and finding cryptic messages etched into the windows. The final entries were filled with fear and confusion, detailing their desperate attempts to leave the island, only to be thwarted by the supernatural forces at play. The researchers were both intrigued and unsettled by the journal. They set up their equipment, ready to document their findings and experience the lighthouse for themselves. As the days passed, the researchers began to experience strange occurrences. The fog seemed to take on a life of its own, swirling around them and forming shapes that disappeared as quickly as they appeared. They heard whispers in the wind, and their equipment malfunctioned inexplicably. One night, as Emily was reviewing her notes, she saw a ghostly figure standing outside the window. It was a man in an old-fashioned lighthouse keeper's uniform, staring intently at her. She blinked, and he was gone. She told the others about the apparition, and they realized that the spirits of the lost keepers might still be present. The cryptic messages also returned, appearing in the fog and on the windows. Words like "help, leave," and "trapped" were scrawled in an unsteady hand. Lisa, the tech expert, tried to capture the phenomena on camera, but the footage always came out distorted. Determined to uncover the truth, Emily decided to hold a séance to communicate with the spirits. The team gathered in the lighthouse, candles flickering in the dim light. They held hands and called out to the spirits, asking them to reveal their intentions. The temperature dropped sharply, and a cold wind swept through the room. The ghostly figures appeared, their faces etched with sorrow and desperation. Through the séance, the researchers learned that the spirits were the former keepers, bound to the lighthouse by a tragic accident that had claimed their lives. The keepers had been trying to protect the lighthouse and its inhabitants from a malevolent force that lurked in the island's shadows. They had failed to escape and were now cursed to guard the lighthouse forever. The spirits warned the researchers to leave before it was too late. Realizing the danger they were in, the researchers decided to leave the island immediately. They packed their equipment and headed to the dock, only to find their boat missing. Panic set in as they realized they were trapped. The fog thickened, and the whispers grew louder. The ghostly figures appeared around them, urging them to find another way off the island. Emily remembered the journal entries and realized that the spirits had tried to escape through a hidden cave on the island's northern side. They made their way through the treacherous terrain, guided by the ghostly apparitions. The cave was dark and damp, but they pushed forward, driven by the hope of escape. The spirits led them to an underground tunnel that emerged on the other side of the island. Exhausted but relieved, they found a small boat hidden in the cave. They hurriedly climbed in and rowed away from the island, the ghostly figures watching silently from the shore. As they sailed back to the mainland, the researchers felt a sense of relief and gratitude. They had uncovered the tragic history of Stormwatch Light and survived the haunting. Emily vowed to share their story and honor the memory of the lost keepers. Back on the mainland, they reported their findings and published their experiences. The story of Stormwatch Light became a legend, a reminder of the power of isolation and the resilience of the human spirit. Emily, Mark, and Lisa continued their work, but they never forgot the ghostly guardians of Stormwatch Light, who had saved them from a fate worse than death. If you want to see more horror stories, please like the video, share your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel. Stay with us, thank you, and see you in the next videos.